So Cheryl, I have a question for you. If a very, very new, let's speak hypothetically, there's a very, very new nonprofit, say, that is about to maybe receive their first grant from a foundation. What might they expect that foundation wants to sort of monitor as they move along? So we're talking about a new nonprofit. They just got their letter of determination. All they have is a bank account. Okay. Can you sort of walk us through the steps of what a nonprofit like that could and should expect from a funder who wants to fund them but needs to, for their own purposes, keep an eye on the, and then tell us why the funder cares so much.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this. So if you are a new nonprofit and you have applied to Sunflower Foundation for your first grant, what should they expect from like reporting, or I'm not sure I understand what your question is, Elizabeth. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm probably not asking it very well. So I'm sure a brand new nonprofit is thinking, yeah, I have $80 in the bank, Mrs. CFO. What else do you want from me? That's why I need a grant.
Sure.
So what can that nonprofit, is there an extra level of due diligence that a foundation might have for such a new nonprofit?
I think that's going to vary by foundation, right? Some foundations won't touch that, although they should. And then what are you applying for? Are you applying for operating funds? Are you applying for capacity building just to get basically started, or that sort of thing? So why funders care is if your mission aligns with the foundation's mission, they want to see you succeed, right? So it's tough with startups because you don't have an audit, because you don't audit $80, right? You don't have an accountant on staff, or maybe even any staff at all. You might be a volunteer-led organization. I think that's where maybe using a fiscal sponsor to get started could help. But again, you still don't have those dollars on your financials because those dollars rest with the fiscal sponsor, even though they kind of flow. But that's a tricky one. Do you have something to add?
No.
And I ask that from the perspective of, why do you care? Like, you should care because it's mission aligned.
I think I'm trying to think about this from the mind of a nonprofit that's out, the thought would be, why would this big foundation care so much about a $5,000 grant? They've got jillions of dollars. So maybe help us come inside the mind of a foundation and what sort of things they're looking at in terms of red flags and what's of concern to a foundation.
Well, I think the concern is you don't have history, right? You don't have the history of managing funds and that sort of thing. Who is managing those funds? Is it somebody who is new to the field altogether, or is this somebody who came from another nonprofit? So, you can look at various different things. I'm not sure that I remember the rest of your question. I think it goes back to, again, if a $5,000 grant to a foundation isn't as important to a $5,000 grant to a startup organization, right? And foundations should be taking some level of risk, in my opinion. That's the value of philanthropy. You don't have to be like the guaranteed this is going to work and that sort of thing. Again, going back to developing that relationship, do you trust that this organization has what it takes to succeed? Do they have the things in place? Do they have a board? Do they have board meetings? Those types of things. Who sits on their board? Is it, everybody's brother-in-law? I hate to pick on brother-in-laws, but is it somebody's neighbor? That sort of thing. I have great brothers-in-law, by the way. But it goes back to the sophistication, even if you don't have the financials to go with it, the sophistication of where you've come from and where you're at right now.
I think I'll say one more thing and then I'll sit down. I think that's an excellent point, Cheryl, that your bank account may not be flush at the moment, but if you can show that you have done some due diligence in other ways, such as who is sitting on your board, do you have some policies and practices in place? That's something you can talk about if that funder is open to talking about it, so that they realize that that diminishes the risk.
Absolutely.
I think this conversation is like for us, we are a grassroots organization, and we actually had like $100 on our on our bank account, and we started it 5 years ago, but we received our letter in 2022, and then it is hard to approach foundations because we do not have the experience, we do not have the accounting knowledge,
Sure.
but we are doing the work. We are boots on the ground, and we have these programs that are working in our community with the Hispanic Latino community. And we approach these foundations, but we only have to prove our work because we don't have, we're learning as we go.
Sure.
And we're very grateful that the Sunflower Foundation gave us the $25,000 for sustainability, because we really needed it, that money. And another foundation that also are helping us is the Kansas Health Foundation. And for us, it's a whole process because we're doing the work, but we're learning as we go. And we would like for founders to know that people in the community can do the work. But it's really hard to put it in on a grant when we do not have the past history, and sometimes we do not have the right connections. So for grassroots organizations, it's really, really hard to get or compete with other organizations that have the reputation, the money, and the relationships. So this is reality for grassroots organizations, and we're learning as we go, and we're thankful that we have been included in all these trainings and all these workshops, but we do need more help because, like for example, we are the co-executive directors, we are accounting, we are boots on the ground, we are coordinators, basically we're doing everything. We're working in the community, and we're very grateful because some other women are coming and they are our volunteers, so we're training them to expand our services. But at the same, it's hard just to do everything. But I guess that's the road that we chose, and we're grateful for foundations like you that are kind of understanding what we go through. But it's hard for us to do everything. Yeah, but.
And I appreciate your perspective where it's so hard, especially that initial break-in, right? And I think if you get a grant from Organization A, sometimes that can help you with Organization B because it starts to build that portfolio, if you will, where they start to understand that you are able to manage these funds and that sort of thing. It is really hard because organizations, you have a mission and you want to support the people that your mission says you're going to support, whether that's food banks or direct, I mean, whatever that is. It's really hard to prioritize the administrative components of that, right? So hiring a bookkeeper is expensive, and you might not have the funds for that. But it's also, if you don't have the financial acumen within your staff, or maybe a volunteer that you can find or something like that, it's really hard because you want to present that information, you want to have your financials in order and that sort of thing, but it's hard when you're getting started. So 2 questions.
Well, that was an excellent explanation. Well, that was an excellent explanation of how nonprofits start. I mean, we started 6 years ago. At that time, we reached out to similar food pantry organizations in our area, and they were helpful, but that might not apply to you. The other thing that was helpful is that at that time, Wichita had a small nonprofit incubator organization. And they sent me all sorts of information about what was needed to apply for a 501c3. And we had help with a fiscal sponsor. So, you know, making sure that you either have one or the other is pretty important to get your first grants, because they need to have somebody to give that money to who can be responsible for it. So those are just some observations, but still, I think the other part is that when you are a startup, we're still an all-volunteer organization, although we contract out for certain work, and trying to transition from a small organization, which is kind of like an entrepreneurial startup, to a larger organization, because now we have some $130,000 in our bank account instead of our first year, which was less than $10,000. So, you know, and that's happened in 6 years. Those are special growing pains, and the Sunflower Foundation is helping us that with this capacity grant. So that's great.
The one thing I'll add to that, if you can hold it for just a second, I think that it's really important from my perspective too. The best grant writers are the people doing the work. Do not hire a professional grant writer unless I shouldn't say that. Be selective in what you use professional grant writers for, right? Federal grants, like they're hard. Yeah, you want somebody who specializes in that, right? But if you're applying to a local foundation, tell your story, and only you can tell it, or you can tell it in the best way, and really share those boots on the ground type stories, the people that you're serving. You can do that better than any professional grant writer. If there are professional grant writers in the room, I apologize, that's not my point. It's that you know your organization, you know who you serve, and you can tell your story better than anybody else. So I apologize, I didn't mean anything against professional grant writers, but.
So I would love a foundational perspective on a sort of different situation from being a grassroots. I'm new in leadership to an organization that has been around, and we have what I'm going to term some sketchy financials on our balance sheet that I find really difficult to, how do you explain that in an application? Is it even worth applying? You know, I put cover letters on all sorts of things saying, this is what this thing means. And so how do you handle that?
Again, I think that goes back to tell your story. If there's something significantly different in your financials that you want to explain, share that. Then when you have that conversation, the funder at least has a point where they can say, okay, you've told me this, now what about these other things? How do these correlate, and that sort of thing. Foundations don't use these things to not fund you. They use it to make decisions based on, you know, I mean, how many times has a foundation said, you know what, you've applied for 10, but really you need 20, so we're going to bump this up, because they want you to succeed. They don't use it for, hey, let's see who we can cut out with this review process, right? At least the good foundations aren't doing that, so.
That's a great point, Cheryl, is that, I mean, you were in this space for almost 2 decades. I've been doing it for almost 13 years. Again, we can't speak for every foundation, but there has never been, if it's a good idea, it's not cut out because something was a little off with the finances. A foundation that you would want to work with will come back to you and say, we don't understand this, help us explain. To your point, I think, and again, I'm sorry to be a broken record, both of us, every foundation is different, but to us, a new nonprofit leader stepping into a position and acknowledging and recognizing there's some shady stuff that's been going on with the finances, but the work is good. So I really want to get this in order so we can move forward with the work. That is a conversation that absolutely needs to happen. And I can speak for Sunflower. That is something that would actually elevate that nonprofit to saying they know what's going on. They want to get their house in order.
So if I could speak to that really quick. one of the conversations that I had as CFO, it kind of almost brings me to tears still today, and this is years ago, and I get goosebumps, but this executive director contacted me and said, I would like to meet with you. And it was a new executive director in the leadership role who came into a mess. It was a disaster. And I met with her and a board member, and she basically spelled out, we had fraud. We had funds misused, and they were funds that came from you. And it was a really, I appreciated the level of trust that that person had to come to us and say, we need to have a conversation about that. We worked out a plan that we would never take those funds back because they had to fundraise. The project never happened, basically. The funds were used for something else. They had a plan. They came to us with a problem and a plan to fix it. They were fundraising at the time. They were going to use those funds to do the project that didn't happen before. And it was a great relationship going forward. They trusted us, we trusted them, but it was a leadership change. We knew that this person was new and they had a mess on their hands, and we wanted to support them. We gave them the time, we gave them the space, and the support to basically correct the problem. But they came to us with a solution too, or a proposed solution. I loved that one. Not that they had fraud, but I loved the story.
I have a different line of question. Do you have any tips on when you're turning in program budgets, you're turning in budget narratives, like you don't want to see so much administration costs, or is there certain things that you look for or that you like to see that?
Are you talking about when you're doing the application or
when you're doing the application, you're turning in your budget,
Most projects most funders are going to have guidelines. It should be X percent of this or something along those lines, not to exceed type of thing. I can't speak to what Sunflower does. I would say that most funders have those guidelines and they should be clear.
I just wondered if there was things they'd like to see, like on the budget narrative. Did they like that to be extremely detailed? Maybe Elizabeth can answer.
I said I don't want to speak for the foundation.
So so what do foundations like to see in budget narratives? This is a great question, and I'll give my thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours, Cheryl. We talked about it in the grant writing course yesterday, in that the main thing you want to see is that the numbers match up in the narrative, what you're going to do. We're going to hold this many classes, and the budget, the actual numbers, the spreadsheet, and the budget narrative or justification, whatever we want to call it. On a personal level, I write lots of grants, so I know how, for my personal life and volunteer work, I know how chaotic it does, and you're like, oh, we can't do that, we're going to change it here, but they don't change it everywhere. So the application may say there's going to be 8 classes to teach kids how to garden, and then the spreadsheet shows 12 classes, and then the budget narrative says 6 classes. So on the review committee, we want those to all be harmonious, if that makes sense. And that's where it goes back to having a third eye, look at not only your grant application, but the other pieces of it, and even go through with a highlight marker with any time you mention a number, does it match up in the application, the grant narrative, the budget narrative, and the budget itself. And it's hard to know on the budget narrative how much detail to give, because I think you do want to be specific enough to show you've done your homework to know how much things cost. And so if you're able to say, it's less about saying, we're going to teach gardening classes and we need spades and hoes and seeds and all. But to say, we've done our research on how much this will cost, and the best estimate we can get is this. I think both the finance side and the program side feel really good if you've demonstrated, you've done a little research and you're not just, what's the expression, spitballing it, like sitting around going, well, I don't know, how much do you think this will cost? I don't know, $80, $100, let's just put down 100. That's what's helpful in a budget narrative.
Does that answer your question, though, as far as like administrative expense?
So I totally didn't
In there, or?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. Yeah. I mean, you've got indirect costs, you've got, I mean, without, you'd be here all day if you went in. But yeah, I mean, so like tools versus how detailed do you put, you know, and I realize every foundation is going to be different, but, you know, is detailed tools $500 or is detailed hoe $50, shovel $50, you know? So you wonder how much, you know, indirect is, you know, they give you pretty clear directions on that, but you wonder when someone's reviewing, do you want to actually write a 2-page, you know, not, that's an exaggeration, but, you know, is
I
it
would err
okay
on the
to just-
side of being more specific than less specific.
Okay.
Because you run in, someone might go, $500 for tools. What are they, you know, what are they buying? A new lawnmower? So I would err on that side of being more specific than less specific.
But I think there's also a common sense component too, right?
Yes.
Like if your budget narrative is longer than your application, that's a problem. I mean, I would find that a problem, so.
The thing that I'm finding is helpful for a foundation to review is what kind of energy and effort are we putting into that in terms of our time, our volunteer services, our in-kind cost. You know, we may not be putting a price tag on it, but if we were to put a price tag on it, how are we proving that we are working toward sustainability and independence and self-sufficiency? That is not in the budget, but it can be included in the narrative. That's just a piece of information.
That's an outstanding tip. And if there's not a place that the foundation asks for what the in-kind is, slip it in the budget narrative. Even if a funder is not asking for a match, if you have match, whether it's in-kind or other, just let them know because it sends a message, we have buy-in, you are investing in something that our community wants enough that other people have skin in the game.
In addition to that, the partnership we may be sharing with another organization in helping this to happen. That we're not depending totally upon you, the foundation, to do this for us.
But I think it also goes back to like understanding what it costs to run a project, right? You might know that it takes seeds to have a class, but there's staff time, there's administration time. It's that financial acumen of understanding what it takes to actually implement that project. Any other questions or thoughts?
I'm going to jump back into the comment about being grassroots and doing everything on the ground. And, you know, I would encourage nonprofits, again, this is all about capacity building, to think about investing a little bit of the precious money that you do have on some of those fundamentals like an accountant or a bookkeeper, even if in the short term it means perhaps you cannot serve quite the number of people you want. Invest in yourself first to get you to a strong point so that a year from now you're not running ragged and on the edge of burnout and possibly folding because you can't sustain it anymore. I again, after 13 years of doing this and working alongside nonprofits, that's what I see. You give to everyone else first, but you don't invest back in yourself. And I know that's easier said than done, but the finance part is so important to getting future funding.
And I agree. I mean, we never invest in ourselves, right? But it does save you time, energy, frustration, and so many other things down the road if you can put those things in place early on. So. That's a question.
I would like to know your name and what your position is with Sunflower.
Brandon Skidmore, CEO. No. I'm Elizabeth Berger. I'm the Senior Vice President. Elizabeth Berger, spelled with a U, just like a hamburger. So we have it on the record, Senior Vice President. Yes. And you can have me on the record of saying I wish nonprofits would invest more in themselves up front when it comes to the finances, because it's doubtful anyone's going to read your grant application and go, well, gee, they're only serving 200 people. They really should be serving 400. They don't know that context, but they will look at your financials. So I hope that makes sense and it's not being misconstrued.
So I don't think it's being misconstrued, but I have a question when it ties in, because a lot of the grants, since I've been where I am now, a lot of the grants are looking for a new program, right? And we're running and operating a magnificent program that is needed by community. We see in the death rates, we see in suicide, we see in the violence, right? All these different things. But when we're applying for grants or a grant comes out, it's looking for a new thing, not to sustain what we're doing, to put back into the house so that we can actually have longevity and sustainability, and we can actually get the staff in place to make sure that no one burns out, like some of the language we've been talking about the last 2 days. But how do we do that and keep up with funding the greatness that we have?
So I can't speak for the foundation. Again, I don't represent the foundation. There has been more movement nationally with foundations who do more general operating support. I'm not sure that I could tell you who they are. I know that that movement is happening because, to your point, you know, you can only create so many new programs, right? But you've got to be able to sustain what you're already doing. So I do know that that's a conversation that's happening with a lot of foundations, and those shifts are changing. Again, I don't know what Sunflower is doing, but I do know that that's happening with some organizations.
I'm actually going to tag along to that kind of program mentality and ask specifically, how do we attach staff time to programs so some of that administrative overhead is taken care of by some of those program-specific grants in an ethical way?
So that's a great question, because that goes back to, you know, kind of those breakout of programs, functional expenses, and that sort of thing. If 20% of your time is dedicated to program Y, you can allocate 20% of that time, and you should be allocating 20% of your time or whatever percentage, because that is a true cost of that program, right? That is very ethical. It is not just, I mean, it's a recommendation to use those allocations, but it should be based on something. You know, like I really do spend 20% of my time doing that. So does that help? There's a question here.
Okay, so I was going to come to you privately afterwards, but I was like, oh, this might be the time to jump in and ask this. So I was that new person that had jumped in about, I guess it's now 8 years ago, but that came into nothing in the bank account, the whole thing. And I put in that work early on. I really made that investment in building our financials and ensuring that stability was in the forefront. And now I am taking the time to, applying for some of those grants. And I've recently received the feedback that we've had the strongest RFPs that have come to the table. However, our how strong we are financially is what has turned us away against others that are struggling nonprofits. And that's been very frustrating because we put that work in to make that, to have that sustainability and to have that foundation that was in place. And then to be told, and we need those to continue to grow and to continue to have the strong program that we have. But that can't continue if we don't have those funds. And so it's hard to see that. And like just recently, two back to back. And when you're told that you have the strongest at the table, however, we want to make that investment into struggling organizations, it's hard to swallow. I don't know if there's a question there. Or I just need therapy on that.
I really appreciate that point, though, because, at the end of the day, you want, when you look at your revenue less expenses, that shouldn't be zero or negative, right? That should be a positive number. Just because you're a nonprofit does not mean you shouldn't make money. You have to do that to be able to sustain yourself and become a strong organization. Because let's face it, rainy days happen and funding sources may change and that sort of thing. I think it goes back to, again, what is the foundation specifically looking for? It just goes back to what they're looking for and what their criteria are. I can appreciate that's hard to swallow. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, since she was going to tag you later.
I am happy to chat with you later. I will say, though, your frustration just speaks to the nonprofit Hunger Games dilemma, and I'm sure it's darned if you do, darned if you don't.
Right.
Often it does seem foundations want to fund sort of a known commodity, the usual gang of suspects, ones they know that will be a good bet. And then so sometimes some foundations will choose to go a different route for a specific funding RFP, which is to say, let's give higher priority to those who seem to be really struggling. So if you got the raw end of the deal on that, I'm sorry. Cheryl and I used to talk about, we wish that we could just have I want everyone to be happy fund. And just,
We never got it, did we?
I will say, though, on a serious note, in every application, if you have the opportunity to tell that story of how you took it from here to here, but then say, please look beyond what you see on the spreadsheet, which shows we're a healthy organization, but because from this position, we want to do so much more. Telling that story, because it's a great story.
And really quick, before we get to the next question, I think some of it goes back to also, share how important it is that you receive those funds. Because sometimes funders are making decisions, can you do this without our support, without actually asking that question. So if you can share how critical that is, that might make a difference too, because, let's face it, funders are kind of making some of those decisions because of the healthy balance sheet or something, so.
Okay, so I'm going to jump here. I appreciate your comments. At what point, how do I phrase this? The not-for-profit foundations support our organizations in ways that help keep us moving. I appreciate that. And at what point do we, as an organization, move into pursuing endowments, memorials, that level of financial support that also enhances the financial support that we provide from foundations?
Is that a question for Cheryl or for me?
It might be both of you.
I think there's that delicate balance between a strong organization and showing that you have the financial sense and strength to continue your operations. But, I remember reviewing grant applications where they would be asking for a $20,000 capacity building grant, and their endowment was larger than the foundation's. And that's frustrating, because it's like, you want to give them a chance because they spent the time and resources to fill out that application, but they had more money than us. So I don't know that there's a point where you say, well, don't go after this because then you'll lose out on this. But there is a balance between, again, can you do this without the foundation's support? And not all grants are like that. Some grants are, we want to fund this even though you might have a healthy balance sheet because we believe in what you're doing and it's a new idea or something along those lines. It's not black and white. I don't know. That's a tough question.
And I'll jump in. So earlier we talked about trust-based philanthropy. So you may not, foundations or philanthropy is like any other sector where you try to continually professionally grow and learn in the field, and there's trends that come and go. So some of the much larger national foundations are exploring the idea of providing funds for nonprofit endowments, because a conversation, and rightfully so, is what are nonprofits, what is the most annoying question ever on a grant application? How will this be sustainable? And you're thinking, well, I'm going to sit back and wait till you forget I wrote this grant, and then I'm going to send in another one. How else do you expect me to do this? Because no one else will pay for this work, right? We get that. Sunflower no longer asks that question. We're interested in what your future plans are, but we're not going to be so naive to think that just because you had one great project that automatically your money's going to flow from the sky. So that's neither here nor there. But so nonprofits that foundations that have much greater resources than we do, the national foundations, are starting to take a deeper look into the sustainability issue and saying, for the longest time, we've always had the criteria, we don't fund endowments. And the reason foundations typically don't fund endowments is because they want their projects to have impact in the shorter term while trustees are sitting on board so that we can show that we're helping to fund good work. Endowments are in perpetuity, so you never see the impact of that in the short term. But that is changing. Now, my boss is standing here, so even if he wasn't, I would say that's not anything Sunflower is resourced to look at, is how to provide money for endowments for nonprofits. But I'm letting you know it's on the thoughts of much bigger players. So that's a good sign that there's recognition that you all are as worthy of having an endowment as any foundation is. So just a glimmer of hope there.
But I think if foundations are funding it, they also understand the need for it
Right.
for sustainability. So
Exactly. And just one more caveat to that is, this is where, foundations and grants are not the only source of funds. A lot of this capacity building collaborative is about donor development and fundraising, where depending on how that structure is set up, you do have a little bit more discretion with those funds, right? So that might be something to think about for the endowment route.
Elizabeth, I just wanted to highlight something you said for folks in the room that I think is important, which is that foundations, just like nonprofits, are answerable to their boards. And so they have to provide evidence of their wise investment of resources in the same way that you do. The other thing I wanted to ask a question for Elizabeth or any of the Sunflower Foundation staff. A trend that we've noticed is in some of those national foundations is to give grants to coalitions of nonprofits or to groups and partnerships. How are you seeing that play out kind of at the state level that you're operating? Is that something that people are considering hereabouts?
Yes, most definitely. And Kansas Health Foundation, and Jeff Usher will be here tomorrow. He'll be on the funders panel, and he'll also be in the partners pathway. They have, I think, a really strong interest, and the funding behind it. They love funding coalitions. And to your point, Ann, though, that again, I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but you all know that foundations love to see partnerships. And I think part of the due diligence or the background work for nonprofits all working in their silos is thinking about, if we were to try to go after a grant together, figure out ahead of time, all right, well, who would actually hold the money? Because that's always the thing with grants that go to coalitions or partnerships. Who is the entity that actually holds the money? And so having those meetings way ahead of time and figuring out what kind of MOU, memorandum of understanding, you have in place makes you such an attractive grantee proposition for any funder to fund coalitions, rather than, we have all these great partners and just give us some money and we'll figure out how to spread it around. Do you have any thoughts on that, Cheryl?
I agree that it makes it a stronger application. I think it just creates other logistical issues, but from a funder's perspective, I don't, it's just kind of like, college roommates. Like, you think you're all going to get along, but, sometimes things come up, and that sort of thing. So, like, just making sure that you have the legal agreements in place and the who's going to do what, who gets what money, those types of things.
And that's, if you're here for day one and staying around for the afternoon, Ann has a fabulous workshop this afternoon on partnerships. What we'll touch on a little bit of those. And funders understand that, or you can help them understand through your narrative, that with partnerships, there is a little extra work that comes into play in holding that partnership together. So there might be one entity that's holding the money, so they need to get the indirect for administering those funds in the appropriatable, I just made up a word, reportable way. But they're also, think about this too when writing some kind of coalition grant. Is there one person that sort of, some of their time is dedicated to keeping that coalition going? And make sure the funder understands it's not just a galaxy of singular planets that are all somehow magically orbiting. There needs to be a sun that's helping keeping them together, and explain that in your grant narrative, and then also let that reflect in the budget narrative that that person needs this percentage of time to do it. I sound like a broken record when I say this, but we learn from what you tell us in your applications. So even a no might be a no, but that doesn't mean we dismiss the idea. We learned from it, and it might inform a future funding strategy.
There's another question here.
Hello. Okay. So my question is tying into the intrapersonal and interpersonal, right? And when we're writing for outcomes within our applications, with us doing preventative work, one of the things that we continue to, that I'm seeing that it struggles to get those outcomes outlined. And I've even went to other organizations that are doing the work, and they said they don't understand how to get it. And that's on a national level, that they're struggling to get, they can do the, so restorative practice, right? When you're teaching these students the social emotional and these feeling pieces and building up this peaceful environment. And then you have the one part where it's criminal justice involved, where you do mediations and you get the outcomes based off of the connection with the criminal justice system, right? We're struggling at this point to be able to get that documented in data, because it's a process. It takes years to be able to accumulate that data that's going to show that. And so I guess my question is, we talked about writing a story and we talked about documentation, all these different things and partnering. I need to know how to get that story out because they need this so we don't have to get them over here. And this is what's going to sustain them for them to be able to be in the community and and connect and the healing work happen. But I need help. Help me. Come on.
I don't have a good answer for you because what you're doing is, and I'm not trying to be flippant, and I might have to toss it to Brandon here because I feel really nervous because my boss is standing in the room and I'm just over here, blah, 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 blah. But what you're talking about is systems change. You're trying to change a system. And that doesn't happen in a year or 5 years or sometimes not even 10 years. We get it. We're kind of all, full disclosure here, we're all kind of trapped in the same cycle here. We have boards we need to report to. You have boards you need to report to. You have foundations you need to report to. We're all reporting to each other and wanting to see remarkable progress in a short period of time where we're trying to solve some really wicked problems that will take generations to solve. And I think we struggle with this at the foundation level of what kind of evaluation metrics can we start asking nonprofits to provide us that can show short-term progress as it feeds into long-term progress. And that's not easy, but I can't speak for every foundation. How many times am I going to say that? But I can tell you it's definitely on our mind. So we're in the same boat.
To piggyback on that, a conversation that I became aware of, a practice that happens in other places, and this is a conversation that we've just started having where we are, is about impact investing. So with community foundations, with other funders, so not necessarily looking at a snapshot moment in time, but looking at the overall mission of your organization and the impacts that you have on your community, and finding those individuals, those foundations that want to harness your capability towards your goal and say that they're committing to funding over a period of time or for a certain amount. And so I guess that would be a question, the conversation around impact investing for some of the organizations that are finding it hard to piecemeal put some of these things together.
That is indeed another trend in philanthropy, along with trust-based philanthropy and funding endowments, but impact investing. I'm really glad you brought that up. That is not something our foundation is in the position to do right now, but it's a Kansas Health Foundation is definitely working in that space, as well as some other foundations in Kansas. So this isn't an answer, but again, it's something to give you all hope that finally foundations are moving in that direction of realizing we can't always have amazing progress in 6 months with a $10,000 project to solve one of the world's hardest problems, right? So it's moving in the right direction, just not as quickly as we would like.
I would like to go back to the coalition that you were talking about. So this is what I think you're saying. So we would form a coalition with similar nonprofits in our area, and that coalition would apply for a grant. That's what you're saying?
What I'm saying is many funders that fund around complex problems that need to be solved by many partners. Hard to solve it as just one nonprofit. It's hard to solve the whole problem in a complicated system. Many funders like to see partners working together, and they like to see them working together in a coordinated fashion where it has been formalized with some MOUs amongst the partners so that there's an understanding of if this grant is given to partner A, they have some agreements in place with B, C, D, E, F, and G to make sure everyone understands their role, everyone is getting the resources they need from that grant to get the work done. What funders don't like quite so much is partner A just saying, we'd like this grant and we're going to work with all these people, but there's no documentation of the partnership, what the partner's going to do, what resources they get, the distribution of the funds. So it's just a matter of doing the homework up front.
Okay, so is there some kind of a legal status if a coalition? I mean, we wouldn't form a 501c3. Is there some, do I understand? Probably not asking that correctly.
And I'm going to look to you for this one, if that's so. And Ann is here from the Academy for Partnerships and Collaboration.
I put you in that hot water, so I better respond. And I will just start by saying I don't have the full answer to perhaps what you're asking. But what I'm hearing Elizabeth saying is that in the process of applying to a foundation for funding, oftentimes they are very interested if your organization is working and partnering with other organizations formally or informally, that they want to know about that. They want to know that you've put some thought and some conversation with your partners into figuring out how is this going to work. There's typically one organization that's going to be applying to that grant, and then they will have a plan for how they're going to work with others, distribute the funds, and so on. It may be, and I think sometimes funders like to see if you've gone as far as creating a letter of intent or a memorandum of understanding with those other partners, because that is a form of that, documentation. And that documentation does several things in addition to help you get funding potentially. It creates accountability. It builds trust. It clarifies roles and responsibilities. It documents where and how the funding is going around, who's going to be responsible for keeping an eye on the coalition itself or the partnership itself. Some partners do then choose to go on and actually form an organization that is the coalition that partners are part of, but not necessarily. Does that help?
It helps me too, Ann. Thank you. You summarized that beautifully. And yes, so if you were asking, do you have to form a whole new 501c3? No. An existing nonprofit can play that role.
So I'm going to jump in on the conversation. Thank you all for attending this morning, and hopefully it's been beneficial. On the comment related to coalitions, so I think each funder is different. When we look at applications from coalitions, one of the first questions that we ask ourselves is there a nonprofit in that community already doing that work? Because then that question becomes different. Why is this coalition forming if there's already an organization positioned to do the work that this coalition is doing? Is there a breakdown in leadership? Is there a breakdown in the personalities of the folks running the nonprofit and the folks that are now running the coalition? Because when you start kind of peeling back the layers, that gives you a lot of insight into, will this proposal be successful if we fund it, if there's already that tension in the community as to an organization already exists to do a lot of this work, and now we have coalitions that are popping up to do similar work. So if we don't see a good story in terms of how they're working together and why that coalition is existing now to fill a gap that the other nonprofits that already exist to work in a similar fashion cannot fill, then that gives us insight as to whether or not that coalition would be successful with funding. As we all know, there are thousands and thousands of nonprofits across the state of Kansas, just in the health and social welfare sector. So we're also looking at, do we need another nonprofit? Or is there nonprofits already positioned to do this that we can then support to build up their work, to expand their work? So I think when we're thinking about coalitions, that's important to think about. Because what tends to happen is a coalition gets started, and then over time they're doing work, and they want to become a 501c3. And now you've got another organization in the community that's competing for this little pot of money that either comes from the county commission or the city council or a local funder. And so that Hunger Games approach just intensifies. And so I think that's why we go back to, and it gets old, talking about your system. So when you're putting in an application, your application should really give us insight that you know your system, you know the players, and the work that you're wanting to sustain is unique in that system. You fill this gap, and this is how you do it. And then you can talk about the organizations that come downstream from you and what they're doing and how it connects, and the organizations that come upstream from you and what they're doing and how it connects. When you can start to put that into play, then that gives a funder a really good idea that you're filling a unique niche. That's why you exist as a nonprofit. You understand the system that you're playing in and who your upstream and downstream partners are. That's a very enticing application to consider versus one that seems kind of like, here's what we do and why we need funds. But when you don't give that full context to how you fit in the community and the other organizations that work in your space, it creates some questions that maybe lead to funding, but it just creates those questions. I would say the biggest question or the biggest concern that I get when county commissioners across the state will randomly call us about things, their biggest concern that I hear if I was going to triage a year's worth of calls with various county commissioners in counties across the state is they are afraid of duplication. So they get a lot of requests for funds and organizations that come in front of them. We need X amount of dollars to do this. And that sounds great, but in their mind, it's like, oh, this is organization number 103 that we've heard from in the last 8 months. Are we already doing this work somewhere? Is that money going to be wasted here? And so I think it's understanding that systems context. When you can really tell a story about how you fill a specific niche that either nobody else is doing, or you can talk about how you connect to those other organizations and collectively, by doing these different pieces, you fill that niche. That's a really enticing application. Just to give you some insight, we're a tiny funder. We're a little fish in a big pond. We give out about $2 million a year. This RFP that we funded for capacity building represented $1.5 million. We had 300 applications and we could fund 65. So 300 applications is a large amount. It's a drop in the bucket to the thousands of nonprofits across the state that could have applied. So then when you're trying to figure out, like, how do you get 300 down to 65, and the margins are really slim, we're not talking about like these were great and these were terrible. We're talking about like tiny little gray spots that we have to draw a line between this organization made it and this organization didn't. So I think my point is, make sure that as a community, you're really talking with each other and figuring out when we need nonprofits and when we need coalitions, because the competition is so tough for getting those funds and pulling them into your communities. And so you want to make sure that you're optimizing the organizations that you have in your community that are best positioned to do the work and then compete for the funds. And I know that doesn't, address the concerns that we've heard here today about being in a strong financial position and then being denied funding because you are in a strong financial position. I think that storyline will continue to grow the more and more nonprofits we add into the mix, because the amount of money available isn't growing very fast. The number of nonprofits that need it is growing at a high rate. And so we're kind of going in the opposite direction. So I think it's kind of that strength of application, understanding your system inside and out, where your organization fits, how you connect. If you are a coalition application, really explaining why you fill a unique niche in your community and the relationship you have with existing nonprofits that are going to then support your work. Because in our heads, it will quickly become, we're funding this coalition, and in 3 years, we're going to get an application that says, help us understand how we become a 501c3. And that might be needed, but we as a funder will really need to understand what that looks like.
Thank you, Brandon. That was very well put.
So I have a kind of a question towards the duplication of the process or duplication of services or anything. Where's, as you see or know, there's a lot of people who are seeing an increase of need of services, whether it's people who are homeless, whether it's people who are needing food, whether it's people who are needing services for healthy relationships or anything like that. So, and I understand that funders would be concerned or worried about, duplication of processes, but where does it come to the idea or the fact that the nonprofit or the coalition is just not enough people or not able to serve enough people for where that need is, to why they would not turn around and help them fund so that you can have more people served versus, just, it's too much of a duplication of services.
Yeah, I think a good question. And not easy to kind of parcel out. I mean, these are all hard questions that we're all grappling with. That's why these kind of opportunities are great, because we're really just kind of having a big discussion about what this looks like with nobody having like the solid answer, because if we did, we wouldn't be here. I think it's not so much that it's duplication. It's really just being able to lay out why that volume is happening and why your organization then needs to fill it. If there's not another organization that's filling that need, then certainly that increase in funding it with your organization makes total sense. Or if across the board, all of the nonprofits are at their maximum capacity and you have to try and lift all of them, then that makes sense. I think really what we're talking about is when we are looking at a nonprofit that might have capacity, but now we've started something very similar over here that's going to do something. And then the question is, well, could we just not fund the existing infrastructure that is already there to fill that gap instead of keeping them not quite at capacity and then starting a whole new thing from the ground up to try and address that additional need that might be coming in the community. So I think it's really about, can existing nonprofits fill the existing need? And if they need more funds to do that, then that's what you're writing in your application, versus creating new mechanisms and organizations that are coming in to fill that existing need. Because that's really kind of what we're looking at. It's not a question of, do you really have additional need to fill? It's really, are you the organization that's best positioned to do that as a nonprofit? You're saying you are. We just want to make sure that there's not other organizations coming in saying like, oh, well, there's this existing need we need to fill. We're going to start from scratch with all the infrastructure that has to be invested in to create an organization, when your organization could have just taken that additional need and filled it with your existing infrastructure with a few more dollars. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier.
So we are coming on time. This, I feel like, has been an incredible conversation because we had a lot of really good, solid, soup to nuts learning about finances. But what is the role of finances? It's really to fund the work you're doing. So it involved into a conversation of getting inside the minds of funding entities and we inside your minds. And I have personally really appreciated this honest conversation. I want to make sure that, do we have any spreadsheet related questions for Cheryl before she takes off? And she will be back for those staying for today and tomorrow. I'll do my little advertisement. She's teaching a workshop tomorrow afternoon. Now, I know on a Friday afternoon, what could be more exciting than audits? But she'll go deeper into the audit conversation. Do you need to have one? Are you getting ready for one? What can you do to show your due diligence without an audit? That kind of thing. Your question, please.
And it might be a off to the side kind of question, but my question is about how do you track in-kind donation of, say, volunteer time or that sort of thing on a financial sheet?
That's a good question. I think for nonprofits, it's important to do that. I think it comes back to placing a value on that. And then it's just an entry into your financial system and tracking, are they working or sharing, 20 hours of their time, or is it more significant and that sort of thing? But we can talk more offline for just a minute.
That's a great question. Yeah, grab Cheryl afterwards. But you can go online and see. I think nationally, the average volunteer time is around $22 an hour or something. That figure's sticking in my head. But there's different, national credible organizations that do that. So you could place that value to it. But the more you can track all in-kind expenses and time, especially volunteer, the better to show that skin in the game. Any other numbers questions for Cheryl? Definitely not me.
On what statement or financial report does that go on for tracking?
Any kind of in-kind contribution is going to, you can record it as revenue because it is a value to your organization. It doesn't create an asset, it doesn't create a liability, but you have, it's an in-kind revenue. So it'd be your statement of financial position.
Hi there.
Correct.
So you're saying on in-kind contributions, based on your, $22 an hour, you could list that on your financial statement as the revenue of in-kind, but it's not really money coming in.
It's not, but you list it as an in-kind. So it won't hit your cash flows, right? But you have an offsetting revenue expense entry. And Shanna, I'm going to put you on the spot if you have anything to add. But it's okay. Don't run to her unless you have something you want to add. But it shows that you have support outside of your organization, and you have to. You don't have to. Attaching a dollar amount to that shows that level of support.
So if you're saying, Cheryl, it's being reported not in a way that it actually adds to the bottom line of the cash flow.
Correct. It doesn't.
But it's another column, or however we want to put it, that just shows you have this additional support coming in. And it's perhaps in some ways even more of a qualitative factor to show a funder, again, people support us. There's a lot going into this.
It's not real common that I've seen it, to be honest with you, in the past. It's not something that you want to put your volunteer board members on there or anything like that. But if you're having somebody who's really contributing to the work of the organization and providing value, it's certainly not out of line to add that.
Great last-minute questions. I am going to put Shanna on the spot to just sort of wave your hand. If everyone want to take her around at the lovely lady standing back there, that is the Sunflower CFO. So she's the one that I just wanted to put a name to a face so you can see she's not scary. Well, we're all scared of her, but but CFOs are people too, right?
Yeah, we are.
So
one last question really quick.
Okay, regarding the in-kind, we have a bookkeeper that she does the in-kind for us, and I didn't know that I could do that entry, so I thank you. I can do that entry monthly, right?
I would definitely ask her what her opinion is on that.
Okay, another thing, we also have a few volunteers, so how often do I do that entry?
That's a good question. You could do it monthly, quarterly, you could do it at the end of the year. I would say monthly.
So that would be under what title?
Let's talk. I don't want to get into too specific here. We're out of time, but if we can talk just real briefly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time, your great questions today.